Over the pandemic, we heard stories of people who were applying to school, whether it be undergraduate or graduate school, and getting affected by the lockdowns and by not being able to go to certain places in certain countries. But we never really spoke to anybody about that until today. Jaelen Myers went through that over the pandemic. She applied for a PhD in Australia studying stingrays, but she started off in Indiana, wasn't allowed to go to Australia until about a year and a half into her PhD. She talks about that on this episode, what the stress was like, how she was moving forward, how the Australia universities were actually helping her pretty much that we didn't expect. And she also tells other stories of what it's like to work in the field in Australia and working with stingrays. So we're going to talk about all of that on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about action. We're going to be talking about speaking up for the ocean. We're going to be talking about what's happening in the ocean. It's all encompassing, and it's very, very good. I'm going to tell you, speaking with our guest, Jaelen Myers, who is known on Instagram as Stingray Savvy, it was a true treat. Jaelen, I've been watching Jaelen on Instagram for quite some time now. She's a great science communicator, really showing off her personality, what it's like to be a scientist, what it's like to do work with stingrays in the field in Australia. And I love the content. I really do. So I've been wanting to have her on the podcast for a while, doing these conservation stories. And I said, hey, you know what? It'd be great if she applied. She applied to be on this. She's like, hey, Andrew, I want to book a time. And I was like, I want you to book a time. I reached out to her. I said, hey, how would you like to be on the podcast? And she's what's funny is she's a fan of the show. So she was able to come on, which was a real treat. And we talked about her career. We talked about her going into graduate work during a pandemic. We talked about what it's like to work in the field in Australia and some of the critters that she comes by. We talk a lot about sort of how she got into ocean science and research and what she's going to do afterwards. And of course, we talked about her science communication journey, and it's a wonderful one. I can't wait for you to hear the interview with Jaelen Myers. So let's get to it. Enjoy the interview, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Jaelen, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about stingrays?
I am always ready to talk about stingrays. I thought you would never ask.
Wonderful, Jaelen. This is a special treat for me. I've been watching you on Instagram for quite a while. We've connected over Instagram a number of times. Your videos are amazing. Your video of stingrays and your field work, and now the inclusion of drones is awesome. And I am so excited to talk about your research, but also how you got to where you are. I think it's a really, really interesting story because there's definitely a geographic location switch, a huge one, and I want to know all about it. So we're going to have a great time today. But before we get into all of that, Jaelen, why don't you just let the audience know who you are and what you do?
All right. Well, I've been listening to this podcast for at least a year now. It's been following me in the office when I'm doing my office work. It's followed me in the lab. It's followed me driving out to do my field work. So it's been everywhere. I am actually from America. I'm from the state of Illinois, and nice. I majored in biology there, just in a university close to where I'm from. And I did my master's degree after that. I was looking at reproductive physiology in fishes, kind of in a freshwater aquaculture setting. And now at the ripe age of 28, I have moved, and I'm now doing my PhD overseas in tropical Queensland, Australia, where I now do the work that we just introduced, the stingray stuff for my PhD.
That's awesome. Now I have to ask, so as someone who grew up inland, like myself in Ontario, you growing up in Illinois, we all do the freshwater education stuff. So my university was in Ontario. So it's a marine freshwater program. What your biology program, were you able to specialize in fishes, or did you just sort of choose that when you did projects, you looked at fish?
I guess I started to get down the fish track about halfway through my undergrad. My degree was just environmental biology, so very well-rounded. I'm glad that I did a
Gotcha.
well-rounded degree. But then I remember doing an internship after my second year. It was a 3-month summer internship where I was working at a place near St. Louis, some sort of
Hmm.
freshwater research center. And on one of our field days where we got to practice doing field methods, we went out and we did some gill netting, right? Out on the river.
Okay.
And we started pulling fish in and looking at them. And I think that was the first time where I thought, I think studying fish sounds kind of cool. I'd never really thought about it before, but I really liked that. I thought it was interesting. So after that ended and I started my third year, then I started trying to take the fish related courses. There was an ichthyology course, there was a freshwater ecology class, and I got into those and started to get more knowledge in the fishy realm. So
Yeah.
I
I
did,
like that.
yeah, I did that. And then my last year, I actually got into doing a little undergraduate research. So I teamed up with one of the professors who worked on fish biomechanics, and I kind of came up with a preliminary project, something to get me a little research experience, and I realized I liked that too. So from then on,
Mm.
when I graduated for my master's degree, I was only looking at things that were fish related, something aquatic.
Something quiet. Now, were you more in the mindset of freshwater because you had already done a lot of freshwater work, or was the ocean always in the back of your mind trying to get out to the coast?
I'm going to say the ocean actually was not at the back of my mind. I know that's different
Hmm.
from other people who say that they've always had secret dreams of being a marine biologist since they were 5 or
Right.
something, but I was familiar with freshwater. I thought it was interesting. So that's what I was kind of sticking to when looking for a master's degree position. I didn't rule out anything coastal or marine. It's just when I was
Right.
thinking of where I would have to move and where I would go, and I didn't have any expertise in marine stuff at this point, so I wasn't sure how
Hmm.
competitive I would be moving into the field yet. So I found something continuing in fresh water, and I was still comfortable with that at that point because I figured I still have time to take whatever direction I want. Wherever I end up, it's still pretty flexible at this point. It's not like if I didn't get into marine during my undergrad, or if I didn't do a master's degree in something marine, it's not set in stone.
Hmm.
It's not like I'll never get there. But I didn't really
For
think
sure.
I had to get there at the time.
Yeah, it wasn't on your minds at that point. That's interesting. Now, your master's you mentioned, was in an aquaculture setting. So was your master's on aquaculture?
We were
Or
looking
was it just sort of like that's where the speed, like you had it in a lab, like that's where the fish were at?
Well, I guess I was looking at, say, reproductive physiology. So I was a part of a group that is looking at artificial reproduction of fishes, being able to
Mm.
spawn them within an aquaculture facility and choose which fish spawn, genetic enhancement breeding for purposes like that to improve um, the fish production and stuff. So that
That's
was
interesting. That's really interesting.
aquaculture is kind of the industry that would use that. They would take an interest
Yeah.
in being able to control the fish that they breed and that they get to produce. So that's why it was on like catfish. I did it down in
Hmm.
Alabama, and catfish is a big industry there. A lot of people care about raising catfish. So that's why I did it in that setting.
Gotcha.
Not necessarily because I'm a big aquaculture person. I'm actually kind of not, but it's just that
Right.
was the environment where that kind of research was supported.
Yeah, and obviously it's interesting research too. When you talk about genetics and reproduction and seeing how fish kind of behave in that kind of setting, I think it's a really interesting thing. Now, in that setting, I mean, you're setting yourself up for a nice career in aquaculture. Did you have any? I mean, obviously your opinions are different potentially now, or maybe they've always been. Have they changed, or were you setting yourself up for a career down that path because you had already worked in an aquaculture setting? I can easily see that transferable in a job, with an aquaculture company if you wanted it, just because you already had all the skill sets and the experience of working in that situation.
Yeah, I actually did not have ambitions to move into that field. I'm more of an ecology person. I want to study the animals out
Gotcha.
in the wild. I did have more of a conservation focus. So I know that the work
Gotcha.
I was doing could be applicable in multiple situations. The aquaculture industry is interested in that work, but being able to successfully breed fish in captivity using these selective mechanisms also has a lot of conservation implications for releasing fish or stocking,
Hmm.
um, increasing genetic diversity, and getting fish out there in the wild that need to be restocked where they've been depleted, things like that. So I see how it could follow my interest depending on which way I went. But I kind of look at my master's degree more as a staging step where it trained me how to become a scientist. I wasn't
Gotcha.
so involved with what I was studying. I was more interested in what skills I was getting out of it. And I think it's important for everyone here to understand that what you major in, whether it's your undergrad or no matter what your project is for, say, your master's, it doesn't mean that you've dug yourself into a hole. The more important thing is what skills did you gain during that time that you could carry on to your next thing. Because the skills I gained, being able to do lab work, um, I learned how to think like a scientist. I published papers. I worked on writing. That was a very important thing to do during my master's degrees, learn how to actually be a scientist and everything that
Mm.
goes into that. If you walk into a PhD and you don't know how to do that yet, then things are massively more difficult.
And the PhD is already difficult in the first place. So to
Uh,
have to learn that all over again or doing it more, that's interesting. Now, so you graduate from your master's. Were you thinking after that, I want to go right to do a PhD, or maybe work a little bit, or had you decided at that point?
Well, I'll tell you what I did after that was I did about 6 months still working with my supervisor as a research assistant. But I
Okay.
was looking for PhD positions at that time. One thing
Right.
that came along, so I graduated shortly before COVID happened. And I started becoming a research assistant while I was waiting for things to pan out. I believe I was still waiting at that time to see if I got into James Cook University. I had submitted my application months before that. And
Hmm.
I was still looking at other options if this one didn't come through. So I actually only applied to this university because I
Hmm.
really thought this was a good fit and I was waiting. And then
Yeah.
a couple months after I started that, that's when COVID happened. And I did also hear that I got an offer. I got a scholarship to come here to James Cook University.
Nice.
But
Nice.
uh, things were getting problematic at
COVID.
this time because I was
Yeah. Big
supposed
time.
to start in July of 2020. So I had plans that I was going to move here in July of 2020. Yeah, I think that's the right year. Whenever
Yeah,
COVID
2020
just,
is when
yeah,
it hit March 15th is when things started shut down here.
yeah. Well,
2020.
once
Yeah, so that
everything
makes sense.
started shutting down, then I realized that I'm not going to be able to go and start in 2020 in July. I'm not going to be able to move. So I
Right.
continued my research assistant position until about that time. And uh, now at this point, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. So I moved back to Illinois for a little bit and spent some time with my family while I was trying to see what my future was going to look like. This was a
Hmm.
very stressful time, as you can imagine.
Well, I can imagine. Well, even just with COVID, because even July 2020, I don't think a lot of us knew how long this was going to last. If there was going to be an end date, if there was going to end in 2 weeks, it was always seemed like, oh, 2 weeks more, or a month more, or we're going to be shut down for 3 months more. Like it from that point of view, plus the fact that like you don't know what you're going to do after. I can imagine that's an added stress on an already very stressful situation in your lifetime, in everybody's lifetime, right?
Yeah, I mean, COVID affected us all. We can all play the victim card. For me, it
Yeah,
was
for sure.
extremely stressful because this was impacting me internationally moving and starting the next chapter of my
Yeah.
life. I felt like I was stalled because I was supposed to go and do this. And I was back in Illinois again, back where I grew up. So it felt like a complete step backward, and that I was a fledgling that's unable to fly the nest.
Yeah. Now, what was the response from JCU, James Cook University? What were they sort of just in limbo because they didn't know what could happen? Like, were you in contact with them?
I was in contact, and I'll tell you what I did. I actually did start my PhD in September.
Oh.
So I started anyway. And the first 6 months are pretty much all planning stages. You're writing up your proposal of what you're going to do. You do your literature review. You do all of this stuff that doesn't necessarily involve having to be there until you reach the first milestone. At Australian universities, the PhD is divided into milestones. So you have the first one, which is the confirmation of candidature, meaning you do a presentation, you give a proposal, and then the university and your supervisors have to sign off on it and agree that you're ready to be turned loose to do it. So in my mind, I thought, I will just go until I reach this milestone. By that point, at least 6 months later, I will have a chance of going. It's going to work out. So I did that, reached that milestone beautifully at about the 6-month mark. Most people don't.
And you did the presentation over Zoom or some sort of internet?
Yeah, I did everything from overseas, and it worked out. But then I still had no indicator of when I was going to get here. So I'm like, all right, what am I going to do now?
even after that 6 months, like after that first milestone, you're in 2021 at this point, I assume.
Yeah.
But things were still, even Australia was pretty much, nobody was coming in or out very, very much, right? So you were still in that point where it's like, I have no idea what's going to happen now, right?
Yeah. I have to say this following year, from this point I just described, had to be the most stressful time of my life because I continued to do my stuff from overseas. Fortunately, with my project, the way that it was set up, my supervisors and people in my lab were able to go out and get drone data. So I already knew I was going to be doing a drone project. And a lot of people in my lab had already been gathering data, getting these drone videos of different things and loading them. And I was able to access these videos to help structure my project and go ahead and start going through them, pick out what I found interesting, and start doing some types of analyses. I mean, with this drone data, it gave me the unique opportunity to keep working from overseas as long as I had the drone data coming in. But that's the only way I could survive and keep doing stuff, was write my literature review, write what I could, and then analyze whatever data was brought in. And that's how I floated my boat until I was finally able to come here in December of, I'm terrible with years. It was last December.
Well, once COVID hit, it's almost like everybody's like before COVID or after COVID. So
yeah, it was a year and a half ago, essentially. That's how long I've been here.
Okay, so December 2021, you're looking at probably, right? And then it's been a year to 2022, and now you're halfway through. So that makes sense.
Yeah. It had been a year and 3 months since I started my PhD until I actually got here.
Man. Now, I have to admit, obviously, it's an extreme situation, COVID. But there must have been a lot of flexibility, which I didn't expect from the university, any university, to be able to provide that flexibility where it's like, okay, you just start from the beginning, do this first milestone. And once you got the milestone, I'm assuming your supervisor, the university, and you thought, okay, once we get to that first milestone, I'll just come over then and then start my field work and the rest and the literature review and everything like that. But then they said, no, we can't, but we'll allow you to continue and we'll provide you with some of the data, which is great. Now, obviously, the downside is you miss out on being there and interacting with other graduate students, interacting with your supervisor, your committee, and the university itself. And of course, like moving from Illinois to, Queensland, Australia, that's quite nice. That's quite the move. And it'd be nice to be able to live there the full time. So there are obviously some disadvantages, but the advantage is the university seems pretty flexible in allowing you to do that. Did you have any Was it like a smooth sailing, like with the university and adapting to that situation?
I think on my end it was pretty smooth. They were quite
Yeah,
accommodating. One
that's
thing,
awesome.
I did have a couple options. So I did the year and 3 months continuously, but I was
Hmm.
at a point where I wanted to have an ultimatum here. So after the year and 3 months mark, when Christmas was rolling around and they were talking about opening the borders, I finally had hope for the first time in a while.
Right,
But then the
right.
Omicron variant came out, and then there was talk
Oh
again that they
yeah,
weren't going to open the border, right? So
yep.
I told myself that if they did this to me again, if they did not open the border when they said they would this time, I was going to take a leave until I could get there
Right,
because there's just nothing more I
makes
could do
sense.
from overseas. But I could have
Yeah.
taken that
Plus, you
leave
want it. Plus,
sooner.
you want to be able to be in the field, and you want to be able to collect that data, use the drone, and everything like that too, right?
Yeah, I had the option where I could have done that earlier. I could have taken my leave after I did that first milestone, and the university would have let me do it with the circumstances. So it was my
Hmm.
choice to try to keep going as long as I could until I knew I
Right.
couldn't go any further, just because I didn't want to be stalled, to keep being in
Of
limbo
course.
without making progress.
Yeah, totally get that. It's a crazy situation just to think about it. I mean, a lot of students were in very stressful situations, but the fact that you're able to,
I know there's people listening right now who have gone
oh
through
yeah,
this. Their degree isn't what they hoped for and what not what they expected just because of what we had to go
oh
through.
absolutely. And some universities weren't as flexible, so you still had to pay tuition, but you couldn't be on campus, or it's yeah. I've heard nightmares of stories, from various people. So to hear your story is kind of nice because you're still able to do what you needed to do. So then you get to Australia. That's quite the move, especially in a pandemic. It's quite the move. What was it like when you first got there? I mean, obviously, it's got to be a culture shock from going to the States to Australia.
Yeah, well, I have to tell you that it was an easy move for me because I was waiting in limbo for so
You were
long
just
to get
ready.
here. I was just ready to go. I didn't feel any regrets. I didn't feel homesick. I wasn't sitting there nervous like you usually
Yeah,
feel before you make a big
yeah.
transition. It felt so overdue that I just wanted to go. And I knew I would be ready for it because I'd had so much time to prepare, more time than I thought. So when I got here, I loved it from the moment I touched down. The moment I got out, I flew into Sydney and I actually spent 2 weeks there because there was still an ongoing rule here where the states had different COVID
Right.
policies. To get into Queensland, you have to be a domestic traveler. You can't fly directly into Queensland or they'll put you in a 2 week mandatory government
Mm,
quarantine. So I didn't want to do that. But if you flew into the state to the south, New South
hmm.
Wales, and stayed there for 2 weeks and then flew to Queensland, they'd treat you as a domestic traveler. So I kind of got a mandatory holiday. I got 2 weeks to spend in this really cool city while I was waiting to be able to cross the border.
And when you're in that city, you didn't have to stay in that one. You didn't have to stay in a house or a hotel or anything. You could move around.
I could move around. I just had to go through series of COVID testing.
Okay.
When I first got there, they made me take a COVID test at the airport, and then
Yeah.
they made me wait until the results got back. And then I had to take another COVID test 6 days later, and then I
Right.
had to take another COVID test 12 days later. So it was
Okay.
3 COVID tests while I was there.
Yeah, not too bad. I mean, all things considered, I know of some people who've had to stay in a hotel for 2 weeks, and do testing there, and that,
That's what I was avoiding.
yeah, and that drove them nuts. So that's great. So you got a little bit of a holiday, got to go up north to Townsville, and now you're at the university, and you've been there for what, I guess just a year and a half now, and were you able to start your field work right off the bat, or did you have to do some training before that?
I pretty much got started right away. There's a person in my lab who also did their PhD doing the Stingray drone stuff. So my research is kind of building off this guy's research and
Gotcha.
answering new questions. There was someone in the lab that I could learn from. So immediately we started going out to some different locations and I got practice flying the drone and learning what I needed to do.
Nice.
We kind of worked together to get me the skills I needed before I was running off by myself.
Yeah.
We went out there to a site and I caught my first stingray. out in a creek, and it was a beautiful Australian whip ray. They got the most beautiful leopard print pattern on them.
Nice.
Wonderful rays. And once I caught that one, I was like, yeah, I could keep doing this. Once you know what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, a couple of questions from that. You obviously have a passion for stingrays. Like just through, your social media and stuff, and we'll share your Instagram in the links in the show notes. But when did you really get that passion for it? Was it when you first got to Australia? Was it, as you were doing your PhD? Was it before? Had you always had a bit of a love for these species? Or when did you get that passion?
All right. I really love this question, because so far when I talk about my background, it doesn't sound like I was interested in elasmobranchs. It didn't come up, right?
Right.
It's because I think of it like a seed was planted. So before I transitioned to a PhD, I really resonated with something my supervisor told me during my master's degree. My supervisor said, don't do a PhD in anything you're not 100% passionate about. It is such an investment of your time. It takes up a chunk of your life. Don't do research you don't care about. So what is that one thing that you would like to study more than anything else? So I resonated with that a lot. And that's what made me start looking into this and thinking about it. And what the seed, I think, started to germinate here when I remembered, I think, because, I was still thinking fishy stuff, right? So I was thinking about when I used to go to the aquarium when I was a kid. I remember a specific time going to the St. Louis Aquarium, and they have, or the St. Louis Zoo, it's actually a zoo, but they have
they had like a display,
an aquarium type exhibit too. And
Gotcha.
They had a stingray touch tank, a couple different types of stingrays and some little sharks in there. And I know I wasn't any older than 12 at the time. But I remember that moment so vividly, getting to touch these stingrays and interact with them. And at the time, I just thought, oh, well, that was really cool. And then it went to the back of my mind. But every time I remember that trip, I only think of me touching those stingrays. And then I was thinking of other times when I got that opportunity and just how much I felt like I connected with these animals, how cool they were.
Yeah.
So when I had to ask myself that question, what do you want to do a PhD in? This kind of stuff started to germinate. And I realized that I really wish I could find something like that. And then it was just kind of like a magic opportunity. I was looking into James Cook University because it was advertised to me on ResearchGate. That it's kind of like the Facebook for scientists, for anyone out there who doesn't know what it is. They were advertising PhD scholarships on ResearchGate. And I looked into it and started looking at potential supervisors to work with, because you can't apply to the university without a supervisor to back you up. And I happened to find a supervisor who had a student who was working on stingrays. So I was like, this supervisor is available to accommodate a stingray-related project, and the research that's ongoing is really cool.
Yep. Maybe
I could get in and build on that. So things just really worked out with this. Like I said, this was the only place I applied to. Me and my supervisor now, we had lots of Zoom meetings, and I kept saying, I really like this work. I would really like to get involved with this. And then it worked out, and I realized that this could happen. I could actually study stingrays for my PhD. I will say that my supervisor did try to get me to think more broadly. Every time I was immediately going, stingrays! He's like, trying to make me think of the broader ecology and the systems themselves.
Right.
That's kind of what his expertise is the systems, and didn't want me to go down a rabbit hole too early, but I kept chipping away at it, and I was kind of stubborn and kept wanting to do this work. So stingrays, it won.
Love it. I love it. Now, you mentioned like once you caught your first stingray, that was quite the interesting thing to do. So first of all, how do you catch a stingray? Is it through like a fishing hook? Is it a net? Like, or do you just pick it up? Like, how do you actually catch a stingray?
Well, it depends on the ray. The actual stingrays with the barbs, I have a good protocol with. A lot of the pictures I upload are from this place north of Townsville. It's this beautiful sweeping sand flat. It's crawling with juvenile stingrays. It's a nursery. So what I do is I go out there with a team of volunteers. We bring all of our gear with us on a little inflatable boat and we tow it around with us. And we also have a seine net folded up on a little raft that I bought from Kmart. And we go and we walk around through the shallow water, typically waist deep or less, until we see one. And then we deploy that seine net, pull it off the raft, and make it a little half circle like trap. And then we work as a team. The people that I call the stingray shoers run ahead, get around it, and their job is to try to corral it into the net. And then the people who are manning each side of the net pull it closed, and then I usually extract it from that point, putting on a welding glove, and then I'll go and grab it or get it in a dip net somehow.
Yeah, and so you have to carefully, like, you carefully get it, right? Like, it's like you hold it carefully. But I've seen you do it on Instagram where you kind of hold it up to show people what it's like and stuff. Mm-hmm. What's that like when you're like holding those stingrays?
Well, I've done it enough times now that I know exactly what to expect. I guess the important thing, if you have to hold a stingray for your research like I do, is always just be mindful where the barb is. Mm-hmm. And you can see I'm almost always wearing some sort of glove on my hand. Mm-hmm. And I actually bought a welding glove from an auto parts store. That's my primary PPE I like to use when holding one. I just kind of wrap it over the tail, wherever the base of the barb is, and just hold on to there. And then it's just like holding a frying pan. You put your other hand underneath and it's like you're flipping a pancake, right. Really.
That's cool. That's so cool. Now, I know I've been kind of holding off on asking you what your PhD is about. So let's start talking about what the research is and how you're going about it.
All right. Well, at the beginning, my PhD topic, my headlines seem to be changing all the time. But at this point, I have it pretty narrowed down of what I'm interested in looking at, how all my chapters are fitting together. I'm really interested in intertidal sand flat environments. So these unvegetated sand flats are pretty understudied, but they are the most present habitat type. All along the coasts of Australia and other places of the world, you get these unvegetated sand flats. So a lot of people are very ate up with the coral reefs, the mangroves, seagrass beds, something with features. But it's these unfeatured environments where stingrays are often very abundant. So I like looking at these type of environments because, and I can attest to this based on what I see when I go out, when I fly my drone around, they're almost always crawling with juvenile stingrays because the juveniles use these shallow water environments more than the adults. They're more vulnerable, so they want to come up in the shallow water where the sharks can't get at them. I've caught a couple stingrays with some bite marks in them. I can definitely see what happens when they're not careful.
Right.
So I'm interested in their habitat use within these environments, but also how they feed in these environments and how foraging influences their habitat use. So I got really interested in the foraging behaviors because that's something that's readily observable. The drone is a great tool for studying an animal without it knowing you're there. It's non-invasive. You can follow an individual and just see how it's interacting with its environment. In my case, I'm interested in where are the stingrays feeding and what are they feeding on? And how's that reflected in their foraging behaviors that you could observe? Because they use different methods to extract different prey. They feed on different substrates. It's all very different if you look at it at a fine scale.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do stingrays normally eat in those areas?
Most stingrays will consume benthic invertebrates, crabs, shrimps, polychaete worms, any little creepy crawlies that dig around in the sand, especially on these intertidal flats. That's where they like to feed. You can definitely see from existing research and from the data I've collected that stingrays will time their feeding to when they have access to upper intertidal zones where you see a lot of these shrimps and crabs and yummy stuff to munch on.
So once that gets covered, once that sand gets covered with water, and there's like a crab in the water, that's when it kind of attacks or feeds.
Yeah. I really like to promote, because this sounds so weird but cool, is I do study stingray vomit as well. So I use my drones to look at how the stingrays feed and where they're feeding. And then I go out and catch some, and I get them to essentially throw up what they ate. I get them to puke, and then I, like a weirdo, I collect it in a little jar and go take it back to the lab to look at. And it's really interesting just looking at the composition of the diets across the species and seeing how they're partitioning resources. We know resource partitioning is a thing. There's competition in natural environments. If multiple species are living together, they have different strategies. They are going to target different prey sources. And I can see that. I can pick up a jar without a label on it and look at it and be like, I bet that came from a cowtail stingray, or that was definitely a shovel nose for sure.
That's really interesting. So they're eating specific things. You can almost put it to the species of what's going to eat, like what stingray is going to eat, sort of what prey. I think that's really interesting. Are stingrays territorial in that matter?
Stingrays are, I wouldn't say they're territorial from what I see. They will have behaviors even where they seem social. So I've seen stingrays kind of resting together, which that's been proven as a strategy to increase predator detection. If multiple rays are sitting together, then if they're resting, there's a greater probability that one of them will detect an approaching predator. So that's kind of been shown that stingrays will be together for reasons like that. I've also seen aggregation style feeding, where lots of stingrays will come and feed in a single area, and they don't seem very territorial. I'm sure there's enough to go around. I have seen a couple instances where some will be together and then one might chase another one away because it's getting the best spot.
Right.
But stingrays don't seem to have a territorial behavior where, okay, this stingray has this little spot that it protects and then that one lives over there. I don't think they really care. They're kind of loners whenever they're not trying to feed in the same spot or if they're not sitting in a group.
You use drones to track these and watch these stingrays. It's a pretty innovative way of looking at their distribution. What's it like, even driving these things or flying these things, and is it hard to do? And if it is, just give us the details, how high do you have to be off the sea surface? Glare, how do you deal with glare, all that kind of stuff?
Sure, there's a lot of considerations when flying a drone, but the great thing about them is with the new technology, they get easier and easier to fly. So I think of it as like playing a video game. I have my controller in my hand with an iPad that displays everything the drone sees, and it's pretty easy to learn the controls. Every drone is pretty universal with how it flies. All I had to do to get good at it was go out a couple different days, fly the drone around. I also did an online course with the Civil Aviation Authority here in Australia. Every country has one. I don't know what it is in Canada or the US, but they have some organization where they want you to register your drone and take a quiz, making sure you remember the rules. So don't do something stupid with your drone. But flying it is actually quite simple. Once you get the hang of it, it is just like a video game. You get used to looking at the screen and then looking up and knowing where the drone is. There's peace of mind tools they give you as well. So you can always know where your drone is. If something completely fails, you can just hit the return to home button and the drone will come back. Hopefully you won't lose the drone. I have lost a drone before, and it is terrible. The stress.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Ooh.
Especially being in
I don't wish that upon anybody.
Especially being in a lab, right, where it's not your own drone. It's like the lab's drone, and you're just I don't want to lose it, because they're not. I don't think they're as expensive as they used to be, but they're still not cheap. To be I can lose one on a regular basis, right?
Fortunately, the drone I lost was actually my personal drone. It was one of those little Mavic Mini pocket drones. So one of those that you can carry on the go. And I crashed it into a cliffside. I did manage to get it back, but then I lost it again out on a mud flat when I was looking for stingrays. And I have to finish this story because it's the best.
Please
I lost
do.
the drone. it lost connection with the remote. It was some freak accident. I kind of wonder if a bird took it out, because with this little drone,
Maybe.
sometimes you got to be aware of seabirds. They don't like little drones. So
Right.
I lost it out there, and I went crawling out on this intertidal mud flat because I had to go find this drone before the tide came up, and it was so muddy. I had to crawl on my hands and knees or I would sink. I was out there for like an hour. One of my lab mates, one of my friends came with me and was just watching me crawl out there. It was something. And then I finally came back. I gave up and couldn't find the drone. And this nice Australian couple that lived up the beach was kind enough to hose me off in their backyard before we headed home.
Oh, stories from the field. You gotta love it. That's awesome.
That's the best one. I was covered in mud. I looked like a mud monster, and I just crawled out, and they're like, "Yeah, let's go hose you off in our yard."
That's so cool. Now, speaking of which, like stories from the field, you're in Australia. Now, me being from North America, not even being close to Australia or never even stepping foot on Australia, we all know here in North America, and you probably know where I'm going with this, is that Australia is known to have some predators, let's just say. Some are of insect relations, and others are, reptilian. And some of them are just like jellyfish, like box jellyfish and so forth. And, when you're out in the field, even here in North America, you have to be careful of a lot of things. There's occupational health and safety you have to go through and things like that. Have you ever had a point, or did you ever freak yourself out being like, is there something here that's gonna cause me harm or cause like my field team harm? Like, have you ever had any of that?
You should see my risk assessments I fill out. They are big.
I can imagine.
Because you are right. Especially overseas, Australia has this reputation of being extremely dangerous. There's something that will kill you under every rock. It might seem that way because when I go out into the field, I have to think of a couple things. It's first, I guess the stingrays themselves, but we have appropriate protocols for that. We can handle them safely.
Right.
But I also have to put in my risk assessment crocodiles.
Right.
I'm in North Queensland. There's crocs here. So
I heard that.
Fortunately, the places that I go look aren't known to have crocs living there. I try not to go and sample right in the middle of a river mouth or something. You'll definitely get one in there.
Right.
I also have to think, okay, I got to put crocs in there. There's also, box jellies, especially during the summer months here, which are the winter months overseas. I have been to my study site and have run into some box jellies before. And I remember the first time that happened, I was like, all right, all my volunteers have to wear long pants now. Like, no negotiation. There's also stonefish, cone snails. I don't think I've run into a cone snail, fortunately, but those are super bad. They have sea snakes here, each one of them extremely venomous. It was actually a little unnerving. On my last trip, we drew out our seine net because we were going after a stingray. We pulled the net together and went in the net to look for it. There was a sea snake in there, probably 1.5 meters long, big. Wow. And it was in our net swimming around. So we all got out of the net and we're using our dip nets on a pole and trying to get the sea snake out, in our heads thinking, wow, if this thing wanted to bite any of us, it has enough venom in one drop to kill us all.
Oh my gosh. And you're out in the field, so it's not as if you're close to anything like to get help or anything. Yeah. Oh, yeah, so that one was probably our closest encounter with something extremely dangerous. We got it the heck out of the net, but we have seen other sea snakes out there before. We were walking around once, shortly before I caught my first eagle ray, and a sea snake was swimming around us, and it popped its head up and actually hissed at us. Oh, wow.
And then went back in the water.
Wow, just like, stay away. And you're like, okay, no problem. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Now, with all that said, like, I'm glad, you have risk assessments, and I assume that, that especially JCU is making sure that you guys are out there and being safe, and you have to always be aware of your surroundings and things like that. Because I know in the field, you can, like, if you're focusing in on a stingray or an animal topic, you're focused on that, and you're focused on like flying a drone or something, you can easily get distracted, and you still have to be well aware. So I'm glad that you do that risk assessment. I'm glad that you've been safe so far.
Yeah, the good news is that it's been over a year since I got here, and I haven't ended up in an Australian hospital, so that's a relief.
That's a huge relief, yes. I'm sure your parents are very happy to hear that as well.
Yeah, I kind of thought that. I'm like, wow, I'm really glad they're giving me health insurance with my PhD plan here. I'm glad that it's included because I'm sure going to end up in a hospital somewhere.
Oh gosh, no, I hope not. I hope not. But you know, it's interesting too because like you are obviously in a very cool place. You get to see some pretty cool things, and you have this wonderful. I feel like it's like a need or requirement to share it with everybody on Instagram and on your social media sites. And I think it's really cool. What made you decide to do that? And I've got a couple of other questions on that, but what made you first decide to start sharing it?
I guess the more cool work I was doing, the more I got interested in sharing. Because the more I talked to people around me about what I was doing, everyone seemed very interested in it. And in, pictures and videos, that's the way to really share it, to give people that experience. When I moved overseas, I initially wanted to be able to share everything I was doing here with everyone back home who couldn't see it. So I realized that, okay, I want to get more active on social media and just so people could see what I'm doing. So then I created an Instagram after I got here. I also created a Twitter, but I kind of think my Twitter's a flop. I don't really like Twitter. I don't engage on it very much. So
I get it.
Instagram is really where I put my focus. And then once I made the Instagram, transitioning from Facebook, where you just don't really get the same engagement.
True.
It's definitely not something the younger people are using, you know?
Right.
So once I created the Instagram, I started realizing its potential. New people were contacting me. New people were seeing my stuff and then telling me, this is really cool. You need to keep sharing it. Like, you need to get this out there. And then it really broadened my interest in science communication. So I'm starting to think that if people don't know what you're doing, then gosh, it's like you're not even doing it. So visibility is everything. And I've taken some science communication courses and have really kind of looked into its potential. And the more I look into it, the more I think visibility is so important. I mean, it's just a social media account, or it's just a pub talk. Like, I'm doing a pub talk later today. Whatever it is, it's communicating. But it's more than that. It's not just for fun. It's actually becoming a professional skill to be able to do that. And it's also very enjoyable. Mm-hmm. It's very fun to curate this content and put it out there and decide how I'm going to present it. What people am I going to reach with this? How am I going to get my broader message out there? We all have just said earlier that stingrays are pretty understudied. People don't really know a lot about them. And this is my way of exposing people to something they wouldn't otherwise get to see or interact with. It's like bringing the interaction to other people.
Yeah.
It's just such a great thing.
When people engage with you, is it through comments, or is it more of like a DM, or is it a little bit of both?
It's a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
I'll get that. And then a lot of people here at JCU know who I am because of this. I always have people coming up to me and talking to me, and they know exactly who I am, and they start talking, and I'm like, uh-oh, have I met this person before? And then they're like, oh, well, I follow you, like, or I had a friend go on a field trip with you, so I know who you are. So I get myself out there that way too. People just come up and talk to me because they've seen what I do and they think it's really cool. And not to mention, my field trips are quite high in demand. A lot of people want to go on these trips. Every time I go out and catch stingrays, for instance, I have a team of volunteers that helps me. It's not a one-person job.
Right. And it's also good to go out in the field with more than one, just and more than by yourself. You always have to have somebody else there. But I think that's great. I think it's great that it's getting like that advertisement. I think also, in a way too, you're dispelling a lot of myths. I feel as though since, especially in Australia, since Steve Irwin's untimely passing, right? A lot of people have been afraid of stingrays to the point where, a lot of them were getting killed at one point, and even worldwide. I mean, he was a worldwide figure, and everybody says, well, he died. Out of all the things that he did, he died by holding a stingray. Even though I feel he would be the first one.
And that's not even true.
Well, I know that's the thing, right? But that was the last animal he was holding. Do you want to just kind of give a breakdown for people maybe who didn't know just of what happened, and then just kind of talk about sort of the backlash stingrays have been getting, or just sort of the reputation stingrays have gotten since?
Oh my gosh. I wrote a whole article about this for The Conversation magazine. It's a trendy magazine where scientists actually contribute articles. So it's not just the media running away with stuff.
Right.
I wrote an article exactly about this topic because I can't tell anybody here that I work on stingrays without hearing, well, you know about Steve Irwin, mate. you know about, you obviously don't know about Steve Irwin. And sometimes I play along and I'm just like, no, who's that? I have no idea. But every person will say that here. They'll try to remind me of Steve Irwin. I mean, this happened back in 2006.
Right.
And it was a very unfortunate, unlikely accident. Steve Irwin was snorkeling over a stingray for a documentary, I think it was. Yep. And then just something went wrong and the stingray darted its tail up. He got barbed in the chest cavity. Most stingray barbings are not fatal or even worth a hospital visit if it happens on an extremity, which is normal. People get barbed on the foot or the ankle because they step on one. But this case was, very unlikely, but it happened. It was a fatal barbing, and that's what happened. And people did give stingrays such a terrible reputation after that. The media throws them under the bus. They just love it. It's just like sharks. Yep. Everyone has a field day when there's a quote unquote shark attack. And same with stingrays. They'll call it a stingray attack.
Yeah, like they did.
A stingray isn't going to attack anybody.
Yeah, it's a defense system. It's more like if you step on it, it's just unfortunate kind of thing. And I think...
Yeah, but I hear it too much. I hear it way too much. The Steve Irwin thing, oh my gosh, like you just get sick of it. It makes me really want to break down that stingray stigma and tell people how it is. I go out there, I handle them all the time. It's absolutely safe if you take the proper precautions and a freak accident doesn't occur.
Exactly. And for most people, you don't, like I always say, if you're in the water and you're not a professional, like you're not studying them or you don't know, but you don't touch them. You just watch them, observe them. They're really cool animals to observe and keep your distance because that's what you should be doing anyway. If you're a researcher, and you're using it like they're a topic of research, you're trained in it, you've got experience in it, and you're always very careful. You're always taking the precautions, like you said. The welding mitt is on your hand, and you're making sure that you're treating them properly and you're handling them carefully, and so that you don't hurt them in any kind of way, and vice versa. So I think it's important. I think it's great that you show how you're handling them in your Instagram and in your videos and in your pictures, because it kind of shows that they are gentle creatures and they're not something that's going to hurt you right off the bat unless you step in the wrong position. They're the reasons why we shuffle our feet in the sand when you're on the beach if you're really concerned about it, because they hide under the sand. But I think it's wonderful. Now, what is your sort of like your favorite moment for science communication that you've been able to produce and maybe got a reaction out of it, or like was there a specific event that you were able to catch that you didn't think you'd be able to catch, or what was that event that you were able to do, or that's memorable in any kind of way?
It sounded like two different questions here. What was a memorable field experience, and then what was my biggest science communication triumph? Can I divide it like that?
Absolutely, that's a much better way to put it.
My most memorable field experience, it happened about 6 weeks ago, where I caught my first spotted eagle ray. I did not think that was possible. They don't usually come up on the intertidal flats far enough where I would encounter them.
Gotcha.
But me and my team spotted one. We just got so darn lucky and were able to catch it. And as soon as we had it in the net, I ran in there with my welding glove, grabbed it and threw it in a dip net. And I was actually screaming with excitement because it was just such a beautiful ray. I never thought I could catch one. So that was my favorite field experience. Gotta love an eagle ray.
For sure.
They're so darn cool.
They are very cool.
And I'd say my biggest science communication win was that article I described. It got a lot of popularity. It was with the conversation where I was debunking stingray stigma and talking about what the statistics actually are around how many people have been killed by stingrays. So that was great. It led to my first radio interview. I published that, and then a couple days later, I got on ABC radio here in Australia, and a lot of people were able to listen to me talk about it. I had people calling in. It was one of those radio shows where people could call in and ask me questions, and talking on the radio is one of the funnest things I've done.
That is awesome.
Talking on a podcast might top it.
Well, there you go.
I like... This is my first time talking on a podcast.
It won't be your last. I'm going to tell you that right now, because I already have another episode ready for you to do. So,
yeah, woo!
But I think this is great. Now, doing science communication while you're out in the field and doing your field work, that's like double the work, because I know how much it takes. Like, it's not just taking a video. It's not just like you're also doing field work for your PhD and your research. You have to follow certain protocols and methodologies and things like that. So how do you, like, for other people who may want to pull out their phone or pull out a camera of some sort to take a video or a picture, like, how do you sort of approach doing both of those things at the same time while you're in the field?
I'm already kind of laughing at this question because it sounds like I have some big technical method for some of the content I get when I actually don't. I bring a lot of volunteers on my trip, and my volunteers actually get a lot of the content for me. I'll be like, oh, let's get a picture of this, or let's get a video of this, because I'm usually the one who's doing all of the real hands-on stuff, like flushing the stomachs, doing the tagging. I mean, I let other people do certain things, but I'm always the one who doesn't have time to get the phone out. But we usually just bring some cell phones, and I'll kind of designate somebody as the interim media person. I'll be like, hey, let's get a short video of this. This could be good for a reel. Let's get a video of this. This could go on a story. Let's get some pictures of this. And, I let them take pictures too. I don't have a rule about media content. I let everyone take as many pictures as they want, and then they can reshare it as they please. I just request that I be tagged.
Of course.
But having other people help you with your media is a great way to get a lot of content. Then you can just sift through the good stuff. There are things that I will pre-plan. Like, before we go out, I will say, it'd be really good if we could get some content on this thing, or let's make sure we get some close-up shots here so I could show this. And then some of them I just do on my own. Right. I'll be back from a day of field work, and I'll just be sitting there and looking what I got, and I'll be like, oh, okay, well, I could edit this video here and maybe turn this into a longer video. Maybe I could voice over this. You just kind of got to get creative and think about, what did we actually get? What would be good to share? I'm actually getting more into making small films too. So on one of my last trips, one of my volunteers is an aspiring documentary filmmaker, and she actually brought a big fancy camera with her and her job on the trip was to be the designated media person, because she wants to make a little mini documentary of my field work, which that is insane, making a little movie.
It's the dream.
And I'm kind of taking up an interest in this as well. I made a little movie, like a 3-minute long promo video from my work out at the gorgeous Orpheus Island. And I made a really good video. 3 minutes, great. And I think that's a great way to start communicating as well, as making high quality videos that can be shared.
Absolutely. Now, a PhD is, I've heard it be, I don't have one, I've never done one, but I've heard it is equivalent of like a full-time job and a half. And now you're talking about doing some of these edits and things like that. Do you find that it's a lot more time to add on the science communication aspect, even when you get back in the lab and doing these edits? Or is it something that you just kind of consider as part of your PhD?
I guess I do kind of consider it part of it. I don't spend extensive amounts of time. It's not like I spend 30 minutes to an hour editing every video and editing every picture. Some of it is pretty instantaneous, really, where I can just get on at night while I'm unwinding and spend 15, 20 minutes putting something up. I don't think it takes too much time to do that. I suppose the extra things I've been doing, like writing media articles or giving pub talks, that's kind of my new thing. I love doing that, is giving
Nice.
pub talks. That's something that I go out of my way to do because I think is important, and it's excellent getting that presentation experience to a normal audience, people who are non-scientists. I love doing a presentation without a graph in it. Yes. I'd say it's perfectly manageable for people to be able to put themselves out there. The amount of time you spend on it is going to depend on what you're capable of doing. But I think everyone should put forth at least some small effort into it to increase visibility for themselves. Not everyone has to be on social media all the time and make it hours a day. Right. It's just whatever you're capable of doing. It's busy, sure. I mean, a PhD is a lot of work, but making your PhD visible is, I wouldn't say just as important as doing the work, but it's an important counterpart.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're passionate about it as well. After your PhD, I know, you might be still a ways away from finishing, but have you thought about what's next down the path? Is it going to be more research and maybe go more towards like a postdoc, or are you planning on doing something different?
It depends on the day you ask me this. Some days I'm really in the researcher mentality where I think, yeah, I could keep going with research and maybe go into academia. I could see myself. I know I really could see myself teaching. I think I would really excel with that, just with my personality, my charisma. I think I could be a good teacher. But you have to weigh your options, because some days I really hate the rat race where the expectations to publish and just getting consumed with the research. And other times I think I would like to get more into a position where, yes, maybe I could still do research because I still like science, but I also really like communicating it. I really would like to have the opportunity to not sit in a bubble. Some academics live their careers in a little bubble. And I know I don't want that, but I still kind of like doing research. So I feel like it's pretty open-ended. I'll just have to see. I would like to stay in Australia, though. Yeah. Australia really agrees with me. It's just fantastic here. If you're studying anything marine, this is the place to go.
Right. Of course. I mean, I feel like it's almost like the area that every marine biologist wants to go at some point in time. To be able to study there or be able to visit there, because it seems like that's what we've heard about all throughout our childhood and as we grew up and even in university and so forth. But Jaelen, this has been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. It's really great to hear how you're doing, and I'm glad you're doing so great, especially after that sort of shaky start to the PhD in terms of starting it during the beginning of a global pandemic. But I'm so happy that you're able to do what you're doing right now and share it with us. It's such a pleasure to be able to see that and observe that and see your science communication develop from that. I think it's going to continue to just be amazing. And I'd love to invite you back on to be able to talk more about your research, maybe as you're finishing up your PhD and seeing where we're going next, and share more fun stories from the field and talk science communication.
Yeah, I would absolutely love that. I am around and I love to talk. So
I feel like there's a Stingray podcast coming up soon. I think we'll have to do that, discuss that at some point.
Yep. We could easily do another hour of that. We've been going for an hour already.
Absolutely.
Right now, I can see.
Absolutely. You got two talkers on here. It's there's never worry about content. But Jaelen, thank you so much for joining us today. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I will talk with you soon.
Thank you, Jaelen, for joining us on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Like I said, it was awesome to have her on. To be able to hear her story. She was very animated when she spoke, and I'm hoping to put up the video on our YouTube channel shortly of the interview. But you know what? Jaelen is a fun science communicator. After this interview, she actually posted on her Instagram the story of how she encountered a sea snake, which is very poisonous, with her crew and how they got it out of their nets. Go to her Instagram. We'll put it in the show notes and check that out. It was amazing. So just cool stories, fun ways to learn about stingrays, tackling myths of, the Steve Irwin sort of, I guess, tragedy with stingrays, but it's amazing how an animal can get such a bad reputation after an accident, and then it affect their ecology, affect their abundance and population. So it was great to hear Jaelen speak about that, and it was just awesome. So check her out. I'm going to put the links in the show notes of all the stuff that you want to check out from her. And I hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions or comments for her, please feel free to contact her through Instagram, but you can also DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean, all one word, at How to Protect the Ocean. And that's it for today's episode. So until next time, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.